Is there any redemptive qualities of the Protestant Reformation? Say that you were actually in the 16th century and you were seeing all this debauchery. You were seeing things like the three pope situation. You were seeing guys buy out the papacy and just fumbling over each other. And you were to know about some of those things. You were trying to interact. You were trying to change the church. You get thrown out of the church is essentially what happened. But like, do you think there's any redemptive qualities of the Protestant Reformation? And do you think it was actually good for the Catholic Church?
Well, I think that in bringing up where there are abuses, that was something that was obviously needed, where there were issues. So when it comes to indulgences, indulgences are not tickets to heaven. No indulgence can, if someone is damned to hell because they've rejected Christ and his church, nothing can change that except for them seeking confession and reconciliation with God. Indulgences deal with the remission of the temporal punishments related to sin. That Hebrew 12 talks about how we have, just as our fathers disciplined us in this life, we have a Father in heaven who disciplines his own children. And a discipline is not always pleasant, but it is good for us. And so that Christians, even when they sin, and I know many Protestants who will say, no, you can't lose your salvation, but if you remain in sin, you might lose rewards, or God might even punish you in this life. So Catholics would say, well, that could also be the case, that you might be punished if you remain in sin, even though you're saved. You might be punished after death to reform you, and there's a natural justice in moving the will back to God in that way. But is there a way, though, that you could turn away from all of the attachment to sin in this life and be able to turn towards God? Yes, and that's where indulgences came in. And one of the things you could do to say, I have not been living a life in accord with being a Christian. I don't want to be attached to these sins. So I want to do something to move my will back to God. One of those things you could have done is, I'm going to give some of my money to the poor to show that I love God and I don't love this stuff. And so that almsgiving is a good thing. Jesus himself said, when you give alms, all things are clean for you. So that is a good thing. But what ended up happening was 1 Timothy 6:10 says, for the love of money is the root of all evil. People will say, oh, you know what, if you want to remit these temporal punishments, just, buy this, give me money for this building opportunity at the church. And helping the church is a good thing. We should do that. But you got people giving their excess funds without prayer, without contrition, and it becomes totally transactional. And the other side is just trying to ginny up enough money for building projects. And so that's why then one of the reforms after the Council of Trent was giving alms can no longer be associated with indulgences. That way people can't be said to be buying anything. And so these, similar things come up to make sure that, you always set a fence around occasions of sin, is what the church would say. So that's an example. The seminary system, I think, was also a very important one to make sure there is a stable path for training people for the priesthood. And they had rules. Not all of these rules don't apply today. They had rules, for example, like a child conceived out of wedlock could not become a priest. Now, that's no longer enforced today. But that's where you had a lot of people like, oh, here's this scandalous child, B-word child. I don't want anything to do with him. Just send him off to the priesthood. And well, that's not what the priesthood is for. It's a calling, not a cop out, so they said, we don't want any. So then they would have these rules like, okay, we don't want this happening anymore. And then eventually that's now been, that's no longer enforced because you don't, society and the things that are problematic for the church have changed. Well, we have new things. So for example, in 2005, Pope Benedict said that someone who has deep-seated homosexual tendencies or openly supports same-sex conduct cannot be admitted to the priesthood. And I would say that makes perfect sense just for the fact that I think priests should live in community with each other. But that's very difficult if you have attraction to men. It's why I don't live in a sorority house. That, and for many other reasons, being married, that would probably also just become supremely annoying in itself, despite what some short-sighted guys might think would be awesome. That sounds like a National Lampoon's film, like right there. So the church will, and that all goes back to saying, look, the church has a duty to prescribe rules and guidelines for the good of the faithful, going far beyond what the Bible says. The Bible doesn't even command Christians to gather on Sunday every week to worship, or to worship on holy days like Christmas and Easter. You have a lot of Protestants say, well, Christmas is on Saturday this year. or Christmas is on Sunday this year. We all want to really be home, guys, so we can skip this week. We can't do that in the Catholic Church for Christ's Mass, where's the name comes from,
To press a little bit more.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
When do you think it would be? Or do you have some things within your, I guess, theology or framework of like when would be a good time to separate from the church? Like when the church has gone too far. Have you ever thought about, because I think I heard like Brian Holmesworth like say like if they started LGBTQ, like affirming LGBTQ, or I guess contradicting councils, like do you have frameworks around your own personal self of when the Catholic Church has gone too far? Because what I'm asking is like obviously Protestants thought the Catholic Church went too far, and so I'm kind of like trying to figure out where you guys think that line is.
Yeah, so the question is going to become, it's one thing to say a discipline is causing harm, and so it ought to be changed. And it's another thing that people might say for even related to doctrine. So you have people overstating the doctrine of purgatory in order to, ginny up money for indulgences by saying, oh, well, here are all the hellish torments in purgatory. And it's good for the church to say, there isn't a specific teaching about the nature of purgatory, about what exactly it's like. And this is similar. Protestants have to deal with this as well. That you'll have Protestants who will be very creative and insistent about what hell is like. And other Protestants will say, well, we don't know exactly what hell is like. At most, we just know that it's eternal separation from God. But whether it's literal fire, whether you're getting these particular hellish torments, Twilight Zone-esque hellish torments, we don't know that. And similar things like superstitions that arose from that, or venerating relics associated with saints. So that even there are doctrines where things may not have been clear, that the church seems to be very clear about this. And that is why, related to salvation, the Council of Trent gave very particular canons about baptism, about how we're justified, the role that grace plays in our salvation. Sorry, I need to put all of that together. The question you're asking, I think, is an important one in saying, all right, well, look, if, because you would probably say, look, if I was sitting in my church and then the pastor comes out and says, I'm a woman now and abortion is okay, and I married this lady. Well, first, if it's a man pretending to be a woman married to a lady, that's actually a real marriage, ironically enough. It's just psychologically disordered, not objectively disordered. And we have to deal with that in the church, of like someone who claims to be transgender who wants to marry a woman, but it's like, well, they are a man. They just are mistaken about that. But are they in a psychological condition to be able to consent to matrimony? That's a question for the canon lawyers to decide. So I hear you. So then it's like, for me, well, when would ever be okay? And I would say it is just flat out, it's never okay to separate yourself from the church that Christ established, because there can only be one church, and it's indefectible. Christ said the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. And the church is not just the invisible bond between all baptized Christians, that there is this church with a connection to the apostles who are able to teach with their authority. So it's never permissible. Now, you might have to tell the Pope, hey, get out of Avignon and go back to Rome. What are you doing? As Catherine of Siena said. But it's never permissible to leave the church Christ established. It's just like when the apostles, Jesus said to the apostles in John 6, are you going to leave too? And they say, well, to who else can we go? You have the words of eternal life. Now, I would say to you that per impossible, if the Pope said, guess what? Infallibly, the church teaches that abortion is not immoral, or homosexual conduct is not immoral, or men and women two men or two women can receive the sacrament of holy matrimony. Then I would say, well, this just can't be the Catholic Church. It must exist somewhere else. I need to find it. But I would say per impossible, because I would say that that's not going to happen. And a similar question would arise if an atheist said to you, okay, what would the Bible have to say for you to admit that it's not the inspired word of God? Because atheists do this too. They'll say, well, what about when the Bible said this about slavery, or kill every man, woman, and child, or this Bible contradiction, that Bible contradiction? And I think you'd be in a similar boat where you'd have to say, okay, well, maybe I misunderstood this passage, or maybe this needs to be clearer, or this doesn't apply today. But you'd say, well, look, if it turned out Jesus didn't rise from the dead, I wouldn't be a Christian. But that's another per impossible. because he did rise from the dead, and there's not going to be any evidence saying otherwise. So I guess that's how I would answer that question.
Yeah, and as soon as you started explaining that, I started to understand the pretzel that I put you in, because it's nearly impossible, because you have to take a step of faith, saying that I believe that this is Christ's church and he will sustain it forever. You're asking me about what I think is impossible with God. And so, like, it's not even an exercise that I'm willing to go through, because, yeah, it's like, if I'm truly saying the Bible is infallible, and then someone is just like hammering me on its contradictions or something that it might be wrong, like the Noah's Ark is impossible. I've already taken that step of faith, where getting me to admit that it's impossible is like a long shot. Like you would never. I'd have to deconstruct my whole faith, my whole lifestyle. And so now that I'm asking you that, and I'm hearing the way you're saying it, it would be against your philosophical, like down to your core. If you admitted that, then you've taken so many steps forward that it would just, you'd have to deconstruct everything.
Yeah. Everybody is in this position. It's not just Catholics. It's any Christian. It's any Christian who has an ultimate authority beyond themselves. Anyone who hasn't, because that ultimate authority, somebody, an outsider, could put it to the test. I mean, you could do that with me with the Catholic Church, but like Dan McClellan could do that with you. You know, he does. I'm doing a video on him soon. Look at all these things in the Bible. It's like, woof, this is a lot. And there's things where you might be more amenable to say, oh, that's a mistranslation. I see where you're coming from. And others, no matter what you say, like, I know that couldn't possibly be wrong. There was a question, I saw a survey question on social media recently, and I think its wording helps reveal, because some people use it as a dunk on Catholics. And the survey question was, if your religious group allowed it, would you marry a same-sex couple? So the survey question was, if your religious group allowed it, would you marry a same-sex couple? And like evangelicals, it was like 85% said no, they would not. Mainlines, maybe like 50 or 60. I think Protestants, Catholics, I think it was only like 46 or 50% said no, or like 40% said of Catholic priests, like said if their religion allowed it, they would do that. But to me, though, it's a bit of a trick question, because you would say, oh, well, the Catholic Church is Christ's church, and if Christ's church did allow this, then I would do that. But it would never allow this, so I won't do that. It's an example of an impossible hypothetical. So like the question, like for the evangelicals, we're like, well, I don't care if my pastor, I don't care if the Southern Baptist Convention or the National Association of Evangelicals says you can marry two men. I'm not going to do that. I would ask them, the survey question would be, if the Bible said it is not sinful for two men or two women to get married, would you marry them? And then, how is evangelical? How would you answer that question? You'd be like, no, I wouldn't. Oh, so you don't really believe the Bible? Well, yeah, I would if the Bible said that, but it doesn't say that. So I think that the problem here, and this is one of C.S. Lewis's, because he was very amenable to Catholicism. He was friends with J.R.R. Tolkien, who's a Catholic. And Lewis believed in a version of purgatory. There's a lot of things about Catholicism he was amenable towards. But one of his objections was, the problem is if I sign on to Catholicism, I'm not signing on to just everything that has been taught. I'm bound to everything that will be taught by the Pope and the bishops. And I don't know what's coming down the pike. So I think for many evangelicals, it's this idea that like, well, hey, I have stability because I know, if the Bible let you marry a same-sex couple, would you? I would. But that is a really impossible hypothetical to them, because they say the words of the Bible will never change. So I'm safe there. But then the problem becomes, well, yeah, the words don't change, but the meaning changes. 200 years ago, 180 years ago, Josiah Priest wrote a book called A Bible Defense of Slavery. So during the Civil War, and this is, what was it? It's not The Scandal of the Evangelical. I think it's The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind by Mark Knoll, talking about how during the debate about slavery, let's see. Oh, sorry, I noticed pop up. We're good. We are still good. During the debate about slavery around the Civil War and about, abolitionism, what was interesting was you'd have debates between Christians about the morality of slavery. And the abolitionists would often get hammered in these debates because the slave owners, they would just quote Bible verse after Bible verse. In the New Testament, slaves obey your masters. obey your masters in all things, da 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 da. And they had to argue from larger principles. So that now you have people in the evangelical world saying, yeah, I know the Bible is really not great towards homosexual conduct, but our view of that should change like the view on slavery has changed. So while evangelicals might think, oh, I'm secure, it's never going to change, all it takes, and there are people who were really conservative in the Protestant world. Richard Hayes would be an example of that. He was a very stalwart guy. And now he wrote that book, The Wideness of the Mercy of God, with his son, and has basically done a 180 on this subject. So I would encourage them to say the foundation you're resting your doctrine on, it may not be as secure as you think.